Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I want to thank particularly Director Ed Steinfeld of the Watson Institute. Ed has a vision and of a really important vision here that is innovative and inclusive and interdisciplinary. And that is what makes space for this kind of speaker series. So I want to thank Watson for that and for the idea that we have a place here on campus looking out into the world, and the world is looking back at us. The speaker series was conceived to expand our thinking and expose us to opportunities and policy options and issues and thinking on topics of women and girls and gender equality and parity and really the insidious gender gaps that plague everyone, virtually every country in virtually every sector. And I think that the speaker series, which we've entitled Policy and Progress, Investing in Women for Peace, Security, and Stability, is aimed at seeking our role in finding solutions and approaches to changing the equation and making it work. And I'm honored today to welcome the first in that series, which is sponsored and convened and hosted by Ambassador Kathy Russell. Kathy is a woman I admire deeply and have great affection for. Ambassador Russell is the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues in the Obama administration. And before that, she was the Chief of Staff to our Second Lady, Dr. Jill Biden. And in her work in government, she wants me to make this short, but I could go on for hours with her accomplishments. Ambassador Russell focused on our strategy and our policies toward preventing and responding to global gender-based violence and created the first ever strategy for adolescent girls. And Ambassador Russell is committed to weaving considerations and issues about women and girls into American foreign policy and into the way we do business. And we're here today at this panel, graciously co-sponsored with Women Empowered of Brown, and I see some representatives from Women Empowered here today, thank you, with a remarkable panel, and I think the brain power and the creativity in this room alone is going to solve some of those problems. So I am going to let you take it over and introduce your panel, and please join me in welcoming Ambassador Russell and the panel.
Thank you, Pamela, so much. Pamela is the person who first brought me to Watson last year, and I'm really grateful for that. She invited me to come teach her class, and then it turned out that two of the women who took your class ended up interns in my office, which was so funny. I mean, they were two of probably 5 interns were from Brown, so I thought there's definitely something going on up here, so I'm really happy to be back. I'm first going to introduce the panel. It's an amazing panel. I think you're really going to enjoy them. I'm so grateful to them for coming. Each of them is just incredibly impressive in their own right. I'm going to do a really short version of their bios, which I told them, so not to embarrass them. Michaela Krishnan is right next to me. Michaela is a Global Institute Fellow at McKinsey & Company, and she co-leads their research on global gender equality and is an author of an incredibly important report on the importance of women to the economies around the world. And I cite this and quote her research constantly, so I'm really delighted that she could be with us. Sandra Papera is a career diplomat. She's in the middle, and also a really wonderful person who I've had the pleasure to work with in my time in the government. She is at the National Democratic Institute, where she's the Director for Gender, Women, and Democracy. And before that, she spent many years, 13 years, I think, at DFID in the UK, and just has a long career of doing really amazing and excellent work, and I'm delighted that she could be here today. And finally, we have Don Steinberg, another wonderful person who is a friend also and a CEO of World Learning and president of the School for International Training. World Learning is a nonprofit organization that provides education, exchange, and development programs in more than 60 countries. They really do amazing work around the world. Prior to World Learning, Don worked at USAID, where he was the deputy administrator, and that's where he and I came into contact with each other. He focused on the Middle East and Africa, and he also worked on the inclusion of women, people with disabilities, LGBT persons, and other marginalized populations again, just a long and very impressive career focused on the issues that we care about, which is trying to include more people in the work that we're trying to do. So as I mentioned, Watson to me is a great place to have these conversations because I think there's a lot of commitment on the part of the leadership here to having these discussions. From my perspective in the government, we were always talking about, President Obama would talk about, you're never going to succeed if you leave half your team on the bench. And that is really the crux of what we're trying to do, which is to say that if you want to raise global living standards, address geopolitical instability, expand markets for U.S. businesses, you've got to include women in the mix. There has been a lot of progress made. I feel proud of the work we did in the administration, and I think that Don probably shares that pride as well. But there is so much more that needs to be done. And, we're obviously at an interesting time in our country, and a time where we're all trying to figure out what the next steps look like. What America First means in the context of taking care of and supporting and looking to help others around the world. And I would say that the U.S. government, and this probably my perspective is a little tainted by my work, but I think the U.S. government was an important leader in this work. And we'll see now whether that will continue or whether there is just a need for others to fill that space, NGOs, private sector, obviously academic institutions. I think there is tremendous need remaining, and I think that all of us need to try to join in here and try to make some improvements if we can. So Don, I'm going to just start with you because when we were talking on the phone the other day, you said something I thought was interesting about how in the course of the work that you did at USAID, the conversation kind of moved from this is important because it's a nice thing to do to this is important because it's a matter of national security. And I was wondering if you could just sort of lay out that argument for the folks here.
Well, thank you. And just to reiterate what you said at the beginning, I've had the opportunity to work in about 100 countries around the world over a 40-year career at U.S. Institute of Peace, the United Nations, State Department, National Security Council, AID, International Crisis Group. Yes, I am that old.
I was just thinking you're so young.
And I can't keep a job, obviously. But the single lesson that I learned during that period was that the failure to incorporate women, LGBT community, people with disabilities, indigenous populations, racial and religious minorities into the solutions to those problems of humanitarian assistance, peace building, conflict transformation, et cetera, is the reason that we're doing so badly in each of those areas. And the evidence was largely anecdotal for many, many years, but now we've got the actual data. And for example, a peace process is 65% more likely to fall apart if women were not involved in negotiating it and implementing it. As we look at American national security interests, though, it's important to remember that societies that are strong, that incorporate women, that address the basic questions of women's empowerment and gender equality, they do not tend to traffic in drugs or people or weapons. They don't send off huge numbers of refugees across borders or across oceans. They don't transmit pandemic diseases. If you think about Ebola, the cost of, in the United States, having every hospital have to address the challenge of Ebola, if you had just gone to West Africa in the early stages and put that, even a fraction of that money into it, you could have solved the difficulty and saved 100,000 lives in the process. These societies don't tend to harbor terrorists or pirates, and frankly, they don't require American troops on the ground. And so if you look at the investment in strong, stable societies abroad, this isn't just a question of human rights or a question of charity or a question of addressing the victims of sexual violence or discrimination. It is a question of promoting American national security interests. And as we move into an era right now where a new administration is backing away, I believe, from a commitment on basic human issues and basic humanitarian and human rights issues, I think the national security interests are going to become even stronger as an argument.
Okay, great, thanks. Sandra, let's assume that Don's right, okay? Just for sake of argument. One of the things I've been very frustrated with in the course of our work is when you look at the political participation of women across the board, with few very notable and important exceptions, it's much lower than we would like to see. When I traveled around last year, people kept saying, well, but the United States is on the precipice of having a woman president, and doesn't that change everything? Well, obviously that didn't happen. Our participation in our legislative branches is low. So assuming that we need more women to participate in these things, how do we get there? What do you see as the most effective way to try to move the ball forward on this issue?
Thanks, Kathy. And my thanks also to Brown and to Watson, to Kathy and to Pam and everybody for including me on this panel. It's a great delight, and I'm only sorry I won't see more of both Brown and Rhode Island before I leave. Having said all of that, I think where I start really on this issue is with what we've learned. I mean, NDI has been trying to increase women's political participation for the best part of 30 years now. And our theory of change says you've got to address issues and barriers in three domains. First of all, the individual capacity of the woman herself. And this goes to issues of confidence, of education, of networks. I love sitting next to people like Don because they make a positive narrative for women's engagement, which sometimes tips over into essentializing women. I never say that women are angels. So just because there haven't been that many women-headed warmongering states doesn't necessarily mean that it's because there's something essentially in women that prevent it. I think we have to understand that structures, which is the second issue that we tackle, the institutions and structures of politics, also have to change in order to accommodate women and accommodate the diversity that Don talked about. I sort of think in sound bites, and one of my more actively used sound bites at the moment is diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice. You have to do things to move to a position of inclusion. Diversity, look, we're all diverse here, that's fine. So what? In order to move to an inclusive society or inclusive political environment, things have to change. And what we do know is that when women do step forward in certain numbers, then you get the changing in the institutions. And some of those institutions, political parties, parliaments, hugely difficult to change. But the most difficult area to change is the third plane that we work on, which is the sociocultural. Norm change is glacial. And really, we're learning increasingly that to change norms around gender, it's not an intergenerational thing. Yeah, younger men are a bit more likely to go with it, but it's not a global, it's not a globally held kind of definitive trend. And we also know that communities are hugely important. The ability for individual families or individual communities or individual people to set new courses and chart new ways of being around norms are hugely dependent upon the power or the strength of those communal bonds. So we work in these three planes. We work on institutions, we work on individuals, and we work on sociocultural norm change. So an example, our program in Georgia, the Georgia in Europe, because we don't do any work in the United States, our program in Georgia was really where you're thinking about what you're talking about. 11%, they couldn't get women's participation up above 11%. But their polling told them that most Georgians thought it should be 50-50, and they were okay with women's leadership. But they couldn't understand that still you couldn't get up above 11%. And when they examined it, and there were lots of things they could have done, they found that actually and I'm going to caricature it a bit. When the average Georgian wakes up in the morning, he and she, they're kind of 50-50. Fine, women's leadership, let's go for 50-50. But by the time they've gone to sleep, the insidious portrayal of women in the media, in society, on billboards, no women talking about anything, serious on television, no women stepping forward into the public space in ways that were significant and not undermined and vilified. And, we've seen that in places where the platform for women's engagement is far deeper and stronger. And so the office said, right, okay, we know that there are 3 areas that we need to tackle, but the biggest one right now is the sociocultural environment. And they focused their whole program on the media. And that meant having a list of women ready for media conversation on defense and security and, yes, education and health and fashion, but really filling in the gaps so that nobody could ever say, there aren't any women to talk about this year's budget. So you do your media ready list. You address the issue of billboards, and you start saying to people, now, would you really like your mother to be up there shown like that, or your sister up there shown like that? You address the schools, the media schools, and you start to talk to them about stereotypes and gender stereotyping. And it's a long, long process, but you have to think laterally around these things. In other places, of course, and it'll never happen in the United States, because norm change is glacial, they institute quotas as well. So there are various ways of doing this, and I could go on forever, and I've already talked too long, probably. But I think if you could hold in your mind the need for action in 3 levels: individual, institution, and sociocultural.
Excellent. Sure.
Can I just weigh in on the question of quotas? Because we have so many problems with this in the United States, but I just want to remind people that more countries around the world do have quotas for women's participation in political life than don't. And you can see in the countries that do have those quotas a remarkable difference, because it does open up a door, it is a requirement. And so those people who are arguing against quotas in the United States as if it is verboten,
Yeah.
they have to remember that they are in the minority in a global sense. And we just saw India, for example, add quotas there, and we've seen a remarkable shift even in the course
Yeah,
of
it's
the
hard to
2
think of a
years
country that
since.
doesn't have quotas that has high participation.
Well, the quota gets you off the ground,
Yeah.
and in some places it's hugely necessary because
Yeah.
women are coming from so far back.
Yeah.
But again, it depends on what kind of quota.
Yeah.
And
They have their own complications.
they have
I've
their own
seen that, yes.
complications,
Absolutely.
and we,
Yeah.
we have political parties who'd rather pay the fine than meet the quota.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I always believed and still believed when I was in my job was that all of these issues are related to each other, that, sometimes when we talk about them, we say, okay, now we're going to talk about women's economic empowerment, or we're going to talk about gender-based violence, or whatever. But truly, the best way to address them is to try to address all these things together, because everything, if you think even as you're in your own life, if you're being battered, it's hard to participate in the economy. If you don't have any economic opportunities, it may be harder to participate in the political sphere. I mean, all of these things are related to each other, and ultimately they all come to whether a woman or girl is valued in these societies. But when I would talk to leaders when I would travel, the argument that was most persuasive to them, most compelling, was when you would talk about the impact they would have on their economies if they included more women. And every country in the world is interested in increasing their GDP. I'm hesitating on North Korea, but even they would probably like to do it. But I mean, really, everybody is open to those conversations. And when you say, okay, you want to get more women into the economy, then all these other things need to be addressed as well. But I would always quote your work, which I think was really important to sort of lay out for countries exactly what we're talking about. So could you just explain that and sort of how you came to the conclusions that you did?
Yeah,
Thanks so much, Michaela.
Great. We talked a little bit about the national security case for the participation of women, and in the spirit of sound bites, I think one spin on that I've heard, which I found quite compelling, is that the role of women's participation in society and the economy is not just about resolving conflict, but about sustaining peace And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about it. But for us, as I'm part of the McKinsey Global Institute, which is the economics and think tank research arm of McKinsey & Company, the private sector consulting firm. And so we really came at this issue from an economic perspective because that's our bread and butter. And to talk a little bit about the journey that we took when we thought about women's participation in the economy, it really started with some work we'd done 10 years ago, which was looking at the performance of individual companies. So what can the role of women in leadership of individual companies do to enhance the organizational health of these companies, to enhance the financial performance of these companies? And so we did a set of analyses across different countries in the world, and what we found was that in companies across the world, really, where women participate in leadership positions at higher rates than on average, so companies that have 30% or more, so we did find that there was a critical mass of participation in the same way as we talked about it with political participation. But in companies that have 30% or more representation of women in their C-suite, these companies tend to have higher financial performance. So that's a correlation, right? More women in leadership, higher financial performance. That wasn't that compelling for us. It was an interesting relationship, but we wanted to get underneath why that was happening. And so we did some analysis that looked at the leadership styles that women tend to display and then the leadership styles that men tend to display. And what we found was that on average, this is obviously a big generalization, we found that there were 9 different types of leadership styles that enable organizational health. What do I mean by a leadership style? This is something like being able to make strategic decisions in light of not much data. This is things like being able to inspire your teams, being a good role model. So what we found was that of these 9 leadership styles, women tend to apply some leadership styles more than men, and vice versa, right? So that makes sense to us. If you put a leadership team together that has access to a variety of leadership styles, that automatically could lead to increased organizational health and therefore increased financial returns. So that for us was a case to say it's important for companies to think about inclusive representation of women in their leadership positions. If they want inclusive representation of women in their leadership positions, they need to think about the pipeline of talent entering their organizations and the promotion of women through their leadership pipelines. So that was the economic case for us from an individual firm or micro perspective. But then we started doing a lot of work related to labor markets around the world, right? And what we found was that across the world, women tend to participate in the labor force at substantially lower rates than men. A country like India, women make up about 24% of the labor force. On average, across the world, women make up about 40% of the labor force. If you think about women making up 50% of the world's population, they're actually not participating in the economy at those rates. What we also found was that even when women participate in the economy, they tend to work fewer hours than men, so more often in part-time roles than full-time roles. And then what we found was that when they're participating in the economy at lower rates than men, they also tend to work in sectors of the economy that contribute less to GDP. So they tend to work in sectors of the economy that have lower wages. They tend to work in occupations that have lower wages compared to men. And so all of this is almost, to speak in economics language, it's a market failure, right? There's an optimal that the market could perform at with equal representation of men and women, equally pulling on talent that men and women have. If you believe, as I do, that talent is equally distributed between men and women, this is a fundamental suboptimal equilibrium. And so we thought about what would happen if we removed these barriers, if we removed these market failures. So as a first thought exercise, we put together what we called a full potential scenario. We said, what if all of these 3 barriers, the fact that women participate in the workforce less than men, when they do participate, they work fewer hours, and then when they do participate with fewer hours, they work in less productive sectors. What if we removed all these barriers? What could that do to global GDP? And what we found was that global GDP could be higher by $28 trillion in 10 years if these barriers were removed.
That's what they paid attention to. They're all like, wait, what? $28 trillion? Okay.
So think about that. That's essentially adding the size of the US economy and the Chinese economy to the world. So that's a huge opportunity. But that's saying, okay, let's remove all barriers, right? And then we took a step back and said, is it realistic to imagine a world where all these barriers were removed in 10 years' time? Is it realistic to assume that both men and women want to participate in the workforce? Because ultimately, participation or not participation in the workforce is a matter of personal choice. And so we developed this alternate scenario. We said, what if instead of fully bridging gender gaps, countries were to replicate their best-in-class regional peers? So So we don't have India performing at the rate of a Norway. We look at what is a suitable benchmark for India to bridge its gender gaps based on its group of peers. What would that do to the world's GDP? And that itself was a huge number. That said that the world would add 12 trillion, again, that's trillion with a T, to global GDP in 10 years' time. That's equivalent to adding economies the size of UK, Japan, and Germany to the world. So for us, this is really an economic argument. It's a no-brainer. If countries across the world are thinking, maybe North Korea excluded, are thinking about how they can grow their GDP, in a world where many developed countries are facing demographic pressures and increasing aging workforce, many developing countries are grappling with how to solve problems of inclusive growth. The question of how you improve, enhance women's participation, remove these artificial barriers that are preventing the participation of women, make participation in the workforce a matter of personal choice, this is a no-brainer to us. So for us, this is certainly about national security, about how you maintain peace, but also it's core to inclusive growth.
Sandra, can you want to say something?
Yeah,
I was going to ask you something. But go ahead.
it's very seductive. And of course, the economic argument gets no pushback because generally it doesn't deal with power. It doesn't deal with changes in the relationships between men and women. And it's dangerously kind of seductive because it also doesn't deal with the backlash of the simple integration of women into the global economy. That then happens in this sort of zero-sum presentation, which a lot of people do provide. And I think, for me, there's still a lot to understand about this. I mean, Makala, you'll know better than I do, that, even Japan would have an increase in its GDP of 15%, $7 billion a year, if it fully integrated its women. Now, what's stopping the average Japanese woman getting into the economy? These are not artificial barriers in terms of always about laws and stuff. It's about the social culture. It's about how women are perceived and how they are perceived outside the definition of their domestic horizons. And I will, to my dying day, believe that you don't change those things by economic activity alone. You have to have a level of political empowerment. You have to have people who understand their rights, who have voice, agency, and action, and are able to overturn those. And some of the most stark examples of, frankly, from my point of view, the commodification of women's labor, Bangladesh. What has changed for the average Bangladeshi woman, given the fact that some of them are now, running however big the size of the textile garment industry in Bangladesh, which used to be 58% women in the market. Now, because of the pressure, men are moving into that labor market, which is, again, removing some of those opportunities. So, there is still something about the need to be able to assert a political lever on the kind of power drivers within your social and your political and your economic purview. That is so. Mine is only a caveat. I absolutely understand and appreciate the analysis. It's just not enough.
One point on Bangladesh, which is, it's a country where they've had the child marriage age of 18, and they're now in the process of moving that down, despite endless discussions with the United States and others about why that's a bad idea. So it's sort of to your point, and I think that, all of these things need to be done in conjunction. At least that's my view about this. You can't do one or the other. I think the economic arguments, people pay attention to those, which is helpful. But Don, you wanted to say something?
Well, I want to push back on the pushback. Because at AID, one of the things that we focused on was agriculture. And we found that in Africa, in particular, if you could ensure the same kind of agricultural inputs, credit, access to seeds, access to titles over land for women that you had for men, you would almost by definition increase agricultural production by 30%. to us, that was really significant, because globally what that means is 150 million people are fed who wouldn't be fed otherwise. Where I agree with you is that you can't simply do that by handing people credit or opportunities. So we put together something called the Women's Agricultural Empowerment Index, which is now, thank goodness, sort of sweeping the development community. And what it does is it goes into a society and it looks at the basic decisions that take place in economic terms. And so you go into a village and you say, who's deciding what we plant? Who's deciding where we sell our products? Who's deciding whether we're going to let that Chinese company come in and buy up all our land and just produce the food itself? And then you measure it. And as you do your interventions, you calculate whether you are enhancing women's participation and ownership and empowerment or decreasing it. And if there are pushbacks, which there are obviously, because the men are going to be very concerned about women seizing control and financial benefit, then you moderate your interventions to support that effort. And most of all, you involve the women themselves in the arguments, because I love your mantra, but my mantra is nothing about them without them.
I love that one.
You
too.
have
Yeah.
to involve
Yeah.
women in the decisions that impact their lives. You can't take actions that are going to make them vulnerable. I agree entirely, because in a lot of situations when women's empowerment goes up, domestic violence against women goes up as well.
Yep.
So,
Yep. See, just to build on that, I completely agree with that. I think, so to us, the economic argument is an argument that is compelling. It's a way to get multiple stakeholders that may not be interested in this issue, frankly, at the table. But when you think about how you enable women's economic empowerment, it's not about purely addressing job creation, for example, right? You need to think about what are the fundamental barriers holding women back. And one of the pieces of analyses we did was we looked at 15 different indicators of gender equality, including social norms, different aspects of gender equality in society, violence against women, etc. So we had about 10 different indicators that measured gender equality in society, and then 5 different indicators that measured gender equality in work. And we looked at the relationship between the two. And in general, we found that societies that tended to have high levels of gender equality in the workplace, so women participated, women were in leadership positions, etc., also tended to have high levels of gender equality in society. So women participated in, women's political participation was high, gender-based violence was low. Again, correlation. But if you look at the micro evidence, if you look at different interventions, interventions that target not just barriers to women's economic empowerment, but also address the social backlash, address issues of education of women, address issues of social norm change, those are the ones that tend to be most effective. So when you think about a suite of solutions, you can't just look at tackling a single barrier, but you need to think about this issue more holistically. Because I think, Kathy, as you were saying earlier, as an individual woman facing these issues, you're not facing gender equality in society and gender equality in work in isolation. This is part of a multitude of issues that you're experiencing in your day-to-day lives, and the people around you are contributing to in your day-to-day life. So you need to think about addressing all of those barriers holistically as well.
Sandra, I'd like to talk a little bit about, so we all agree that we want to get more women participating across the board. There are some challenges. I would like to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the barriers. And I think that you have done some really interesting work about the violence that women are facing as they try to run for office, the online violence and harassment that women are facing. Gender-based violence, you know, we all know these numbers, 1 in 3 women faces some form of violence in her lifetime. I mean, it's an extraordinary number when you think about that. And I'd just be curious about how you see that sort of as a factor in the effort to get more women participating in the political systems.
Well, our whole approach is based on the idea that there are barriers, and that you have to knock over those barriers. And that's, as I said, in our teleology, you've got the three buckets of them. The issue of violence for us is it's a lightning rod, really. First of all, we see that it has 3 key characteristics. First of all, it can be gendered in its actual manifestation. It's gendered in the terms of who it's attacking, and it has gendered impacts. And the sort of 2 from our point of view, because we are focused on democratic inclusion, the two further, if you like, outputs from this are that the violence becomes yet another barrier, and more importantly, it undermines democratic integrity. I mean, for us, a democracy that does not allow the full representation of women in their own voice, in their own right, without fear or threat of reprisal, is in itself undemocratic. I mean, that's where we start. So let me give you an example of some of the things that we've been looking at. Beginning of last year, Uganda went to elections. Some of you will know a bit about Uganda. The politics there is muscular, let's put it that way. And Museveni's not giving up anytime soon. The opposition is under great duress. So there is an opposition rally. And it's a mixed opposition rally. It's got a woman leader in it. And they are set upon by the police. Well, that's political violence. The moment at which somehow or other the woman ended up naked in public, now that's a gendered act of violence against a woman in politics. Its intent was very clear. Unclothing any woman anywhere in the world in public is a gendered act of violence. And it sends a message which says, this space is not for you. And that's the gendered impact of that message. So we are very clear about what this sort of violence leads to, and emerging statistics, there's not enough data yet, but emerging data from polls and surveys tell us that this sort of violence has a particularly discouraging impact on young women. Young women who see high-profile women being vilified, pilloried, attacked, excoriated online, offline, they step back. They step back from the political space. And this is serious. Obviously, this is serious for the next generation. We all obviously have had a sense of the rising levels of violence that women face. IPU did a survey, the International Parliamentary Union, did a survey of parliaments around the world, and they found that 80% of women parliamentarians said that they had faced some level of discrimination, harassment, violence. And the definition of violence in this space is exactly aligned with the international definition of violence against a woman. It is that coercion, threat, physical assault that prevents women from taking up their full rights in whichever domain of life that they wish to do so. So for us, it's hugely important. In fact, I was very excited on Friday. I had a conversation with a young woman who used to be in Vice President Biden's office working on the Violence Against Women initiative. And I said to her, we've been thinking about this problem you've got, whereby women in politics, a lot of them, whether they are formally elected or not, and we say women in politics includes all women activists. And frankly, if you're an environmental activist, if you're young, marginalized, physically, geographically, or by your ethnic group, you are at the most vulnerable, the most vulnerable. We've spotted something which says that a lot of women in politics are, if you like, harassed, victimized, trolled online. And then sometimes it tips over. It tips over into violence. I said to her, what do you know from the domestic violence space about this business of, if you like, a rising threat of increasing levels of violence if the lower levels of violence aren't dealt with, if there's impunity around those? And certainly online, and Kathy, your initiative on this still goes strong, so we're very happy about that. Certainly online, there's a huge impunity around what people say and do online. But tragically, we also know that can cross over into the real world. And, Jo Cox's murder last year was a key example of that. She'd been trolled by her eventual murderer online. The police had spoken to him, but it wasn't enough to deter him. And I think any of you who've worked in the domestic violence space, in the intimate partner violence space, know this very well. So, I said to her, what do you know? And she said, there's this thing called a lethality assessment. And I said, yeah, we've got to do something about that and provide women who are in politics some kind of a tool. Because if it's going to take the collection of, your own personal, if you like, your own personal diary of these many, many acts in order to persuade people, whether it is the Facebooks or the Twitters or whoever it is, that they have to do something against the people you're trolling, some of whom are now transnational, many of whom are linked across different political groups. If we've got to help women develop those sorts of records in order to get the relevant authorities to take action, then that's something we need to do. And it's, as I said, it's in my bag, the article reading about this lethality assessment. But it's the sort of thing that increasingly we're going to have to think about.
It was in the Post a couple of months ago, and there were two Post reporters married to each other, a man and a woman, and the man was struck by how vitriolic the comments were against his wife for comparable things, nothing that she had written that was any more inflammatory. But women, for whatever reason, it like really peaks, and not always certainly, but you see it more often than with men. Okay, I'm going to ask Don a more positive question. I don't want to leave everyone feeling negative about this, but it's a little bit of a loaded question, so I'm sorry about that. But so every year, Bill and Melinda Gates do a letter, and they talk about kind of their assessment of where things stand in the world. And this year, I thought the letter was really interesting, and they talked about how we've made big reductions in extreme poverty, in childhood deaths, that we've done a lot of important and great work on vaccines, that we've increased contraceptive use in a really important way. And so a fairly positive argument for why it matters to do this work, why development matters. We also now see, and this is where it's more loaded, and I'm sorry about that, but we see reports in the press that there are some in the new administration who may not see the value in that and who are thinking about cutting the State Department budget, which is already woefully inadequate, cutting USAID, and I would be curious to know what your sense of this. I mean, do you think, okay, this is a leading question,
Right.
do you think development works? Is it worth the investment on the part of the United States government?
Tough question. I guess yes is the short answer. Let me step back for a second, because when I was asked by President Obama to serve in the sub-cabinet as the deputy administrator, I talked with people at the White House and I said, I see one major problem in accepting this role, and that is that AID is not a gender-sensitive institution, and this makes no sense to me, given my background, given the history. And I basically cut a deal whereby I was allowed to spend about half my time working on issues of marginalization and inclusion. And we decided to do 5 things right away. The first was to institute a provision that said every single USAID project has to have a gender impact statement. And we were the first government agency that ever did that. And I will tell you, the first impact statement I got, and I'm serious about this, it was about a bridge we were building, and the impact statement was 1 sentence, and it said 50% of the people using that bridge will be women.
That's lazy.
Well, it's lazy and it's stupid, and we denied the project.
Yeah.
We said, no, we're not going to go ahead with that project until you do an analysis. We then did a similar thing for a dam, and the response was essentially the same thing. And I went back and I said, look, you're going to displace 100,000 people when you build that dam. What is that going to do to gender relationships? You're going to hire 10,000 men to build the dam. What is that going to do to the labor market and gender? Right now in this country and around the world, 4 million people, women and children, die each year from breathing smoke, from cooking inside their houses, respiratory illnesses. Are you going to make sure the electricity that's generated from that dam is going to go to help women not do that? They said, yeah, those are interesting questions too. So to do that was a major step. Secondly, we hadn't updated any of our policies for 20 years. And what does that say? So we instituted a system whereby we had small working groups throughout the organization put together year-long strategies for women, peace, and security, economic growth, eliminating child marriage, attacking trafficking in persons, and addressing gender-based violence. And we could have written those right at the beginning, but we thought it was important to get the agency, and especially the career officers, to really pay attention to them. And so in 2012, a whole series of these documents came out. Third, we instituted a rule that no one could be a mission director, which is the equivalent of being an ambassador, unless they had a proven history of involving women and people with disabilities and the LGBT community and indigenous populations in their work. And there was one very prominent person who did not have that background, and we denied that man the job, and we made it clear why we were doing it, sending a signal to every person in the leadership requirement that your personal career will be affected if you don't do this. Fourth, we instituted a program where we put $15 million to train women peace builders around the world. And I had the privilege of announcing this at Afad University, which is that great women's university in Khartoum. And to pick up on Sandra's point, not only did we provide stipends and training, but we also provided physical security for any woman who was willing to step forward and enter into a peace process, because the challenges that you're talking about in political life are tripled when you start talking about women in peace processes as well. And then finally, we brought in 3 of the most talented people that I know as a dream team, and that was Carla Coppell, who became our gender advisor, who is now a vice president at USIP, and she oversaw everything. We brought in Karen Groen, who changed all of our regulations to require us to be reporting, because if you don't measure something, you don't value it. And so Karen is now the gender advisor at the World Bank. And we brought in Sarah Mendelson, who was going to focus on the political and the human rights dimensions here. And as you know, Sarah eventually became our UN ambassador to ECOSOC. And so bringing those 3 people in and empowering them, and indeed including them in the executive suite and getting them, offices on the 6th floor of the AID building was essential to all of that. I do not believe that having taken those steps, they are now institutionalized in each case. Yes, there will be pushback. Yes, there will be less emphasis. Yes, there will be less resources. But that's the way you institutionalize change. And frankly, I think the work that you did at the State Department has made it almost impossible for them to eliminate that position or minimize the importance of it.
I hope that's true. I really do. I think we spent a lot of time trying to integrate for just that reason, but it still keeps me up at night. So, okay, Catherine suggested that we take some questions from, I could do this, like, I think I've gotten like 3 of all those things asked on my list, so I don't want to hog all the time. So I'm happy, yeah. Go ahead, Brian, of course.
Thank you. An excellent panel, I must say, and a lot of experience. John, about 40 years ago, we created an office called Women in Development at USAID, and I think you're right. And your criticism was correct, and your corrections were correct, because it was an island. It was an island. We often brought academics in to study women in development issues. The studies rotated around the agency, but no one paid enough attention to really integrate them into the development program. So I congratulate you for that. And Sandra, as you know, I've been associated with NDI for a long time, and I've never seen NDI do as much for women in politics in particular. A few years ago, at the Humphrey School, we did a study, a poll in Minnesota, and found that 1 out of every 4 women in Minnesota, in the middle of the Midwest, had been violated abused in one way or the other. And I did a column for the Star Tribune on that issue, I've never seen such abusive comments made to me by men. You know, why don't you have an institute or a center for men in politics? So that leads me to my
That's it.
question. We talked a lot about violence. We talked a lot about the inability of women to deal with that and to compete in economics and politics. How much can be done to try to, I'll preface it by saying this, we talk a lot today about culture wars in this country. And I think we were, at least I was disappointed at the number of women that voted for the other candidate when we had a woman candidate. What can be done as you work with women to try to empower them to deal with the culture wars that you face in the developing countries, because they're even more severe than they are here in terms of the bias against women. You really are attacking old mores and folkways in these societies.
Well,
Do you want me to start? Okay. I would say a couple things about it. One, I agree with the premise that it's a pervasive challenge, and we have to try to figure out how to address it in a more comprehensive way. From my perspective, the key is that we have to understand that we're not, and this happens a lot, we're not just talking to women about this. And this happens more often than I'd like to say, where I would put together a trip, or I'd say I'm going to X country, and the embassy would send back a proposal thing. And I'm meeting with women legislators, women parliamentarians, women NGO folks. And I'm like, this really isn't the point, right? We have to work with men and boys too. And this is anecdotal, but I am the mother of a son and a daughter. And from my anecdotal experience, boys do not come out of the womb with these gender norms, right? These are learned norms, and we have to work with young people, we have to work with boys and girls, and we have to try to change these cultures. I think that the work Sandra does is so important because they need to see women leaders in their country. I think that's important for men and for women, for boys and for girls, and I think the economic piece is critical as well, because Don's right, when women have some economic independence, you frequently see an uptick of violence in the family because it upsets the gender power balance. But over time, that evens out, and they see that women can participate. It's helpful for the family. It's helpful for the community. So that's I don't know, Sandra, if you have a different sense of it, but I think that.
Yeah, just to quickly add to what Kathy was saying, so I completely agree with everything that you said. I wanted to just add with one interesting example in terms of a type of intervention that we've seen start to have some success. So Gap, which is the clothing company, has started a program called the PACE program. And what they do is they've partnered with their factories to provide training to the women in their factories. And some of it is technical skills training, but some of it is also just life skills training, confidence building. It's a space for women to talk and communicate with each other, build a network. And it's early days yet in terms of the evaluation of how successful that has been, but the early results from this intervention, one suggests that women's productivity at work has increased as a consequence of this type of intervention. The second thing that the women are saying is that they feel more comfortable going back to their homes and feeling confident in their power relationship or power dynamic in the home. So I think we need more of this type of study of intervention, more robust impact evaluations, better data to understand what types of interventions, now these are more micro interventions, but what types of interventions can work. And then frankly, how to engage husbands and communities in this conversation. I had an interesting conversation once with a local company in India, and they were talking about trying to get more women to participate in their workplace. And one of the things that they were trying was providing a benefits program that not only included husbands, but also included in-laws, just because in the Indian context, in-laws are often the determinant of whether the daughter-in-law can go to the workplace or not. So again, I think we need more of these kinds of solutions, more robust evaluation of what works in what context, and how you translate learnings from one geography to the other.
so I wanted to just talk a little bit about my experience in Guatemala, because in Guatemala, up until 12 years ago, domestic violence was not a crime. It was considered a cultural practice. And you may know Claudia Paz y Paz, who was the incredible Attorney General of that country. She came to us and said, how are we going to affect this? And so we launched this program to educate parliamentarians, and they passed a law that said it is now a crime. But they also said in that law that you had to report it and have it considered in front of a judge within 8 hours of the actual occurrence. And Claudia said, you know, I'm not going to go back and try and get this changed, but would you help me create a mechanism to address this? And so in Guatemala City right now, if you go down to the courthouse, you walk in the front door. If you go to the right, it's a normal courthouse. If you go to the left, it is a 24-hour court that is open 24 hours a day. If you as a victimized woman walk in the front door, the first person you see is a doctor who will treat you and take evidence. The next person you see is a lawyer and a policeman who will tell you what your options are. The third person you see is a judge who is there 24 hours a day, and I went there at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he was sitting there, who will take your case. The next person you meet is the psychosocial counselor who will help you through. And then the last person you meet is a social worker who has resources, who will go with you to take your kids out of the abusive home. If you need that, who will send you back to your village, who will find a halfway house for you if you need that. The difference between when women would walk in the front door and when they left in the back was incredible. And then Claudia took me to a place called Nibaj, which is a small city in the mountains of Guatemala. And she said, this is a place where we're trying to get at the cultural norms as well. And I walked in and we had lunch with about 30 women, all of whom were illiterate, all of whom were mostly unemployed, but they were exercising political power. They had come together and they were sending petitions to the governor. They were engaging the local business community. They were having an impact. And then one man was in the room, and he stood up about halfway through, and he said, I want to tell you my story. I was born in this village. When I was growing up, my dad would beat my mother. It was a regular occurrence. He would get his paycheck on Fridays. He would get drunk, and he'd come home and beat my mom. And I was a little kid. I was powerless to do anything about it. So when I grew up, in order to prove that I was a man, I started beating my wife. And then I came to these meetings, and I saw the impact that I was having. And he said, about 6 months ago, my wife gave birth to a baby boy. And I held that boy in my arms, and I said, enough is enough. This stops with me. And he said he would never engage in domestic violence, and he would do whatever he could to fight it. And so it is possible to change social norms, and it is possible to change people's views. But you got to do it in a conscientious and an applied way.
Any other questions?
Thank you all for such an engaging discussion. Ambassador Russell, you began the conversation noting all the work that the Obama administration had done through the State Department to promote gender equality, and that now we're in a different terrain. And there may be space for NGOs and the private sector to engage in aspects of this. And I wondered if the panel could elaborate a little bit more on this. So where are places where the NGOs and the private sector can pick up the pieces that may be neglected in the new climate? And then what are pieces that really have to come from a State Department to be able to do that?
You know, it's tough because when I would travel, people would always talk to me about how much American leadership mattered in this space. And I worry that that can't completely be replaced. You know, there are signs that this new administration, I think they probably will keep my position, which is a positive. I don't know, they probably will move it someplace else, and I would imagine not focus on it, but I think they'll probably keep it. The daughter is talking about the importance of women's economic empowerment. So that's something, right? That's something. So I think other countries will step up. I mean, we saw the Nordics step up and say we will make a contribution on this on the family planning side, because the United States is now likely to do much less of that than we've done in the past. So I think other countries will do things, will try. And I'm going to let my colleagues talk about the specifics, particularly, and I think it'd be interesting to hear about the private sector, because I think there is an important role for the private sector. But and this could just be my own bias, so I recognize that, but I worry about a lack of U.S. leadership, because everyone looks to us. It's not that they can't do things on their own, but it's just different. I mean, the closest is DFID that does the
Yeah.
work. It's the closest. And the Nordics are amazing, but the United States, for better, for worse, we're not always perfect and all the rest of it. We have problems of our own, but I think countries believed that we cared about this issue and that we were committed to it. And the fact that the president would speak about it routinely, and he would, you could ask President Obama about female genital mutilation and cutting, and he would give you, he understood it. He understood the problem of child marriage. This stuff was, I'm not saying it's intuitive to him, although it probably was, but he also was informed about it. He understood the significance, and the world saw that. And we also tried to put our money where our mouths were. We not as much as we wanted, but we did invest in this. And I think now, when they talk about these cuts, and this is what I'm so worried about it, we literally, the State Department has so little money anyway, and there's so little discretionary money. And if they start cutting that, it's just hard to know what happens. So I mean, maybe the best case is that they don't do too much damage in 4 years. I know, I'm sorry, that's so political, Catherine. You told me not to be so political, but I mean, maybe that's the best case, and then we try to get back and fix it. But I would be interested to know what you think about the private sector, because we really did try to do more and more with the private sector, because they are incredibly influential around the world, and I think can have a real impact in some of the space.
Yeah, so maybe I can start by talking about the different roles our work identified for the private sector, and then maybe a little bit about the conversations we've been having coming out of our work with different private sector companies. So our work essentially identified 4 roles that the private sector can play. I think the one that has received the most attention, not surprisingly, is the private sector looking internally, right, within its 4 walls. How do they help get women into their organizations, promote them, have women in the C-suite and boards, etc. And I think this is now a topic that, at least in the US, seems to be getting a lot of attention. A lot of our clients are asking us questions about this work. We as McKinsey, actually serve a lot of clients on the question of diversity and inclusion. So there seems to at least be some interest and energy around the role of women within organizations, particularly, I would say, in our Western Europe and US offices, but also, frankly, with many private sector companies that we've had conversations with in our India office, for example. The second role we've started seeing the private sector play more and more of is the private sector, particularly multinationals, thinking about the role of women in their supply chains as well as distribution channels. I think this has gone hand in hand with the role of supporting women entrepreneurs. And we've seen examples of big, large multinational companies operating in India, for example, that are looking to do this. And I think encouragingly more and more local companies that are large enough to have a large supply chain, have large distribution channels, also get excited about that. And I'll come back to that towards the end of my comments here. The third role that we have, again, started to see some interest from private sector companies is them thinking about their products and services and how they can think about better engaging women as consumers, right? Because as, again, the purchasing power of women increases, women are increasingly making more and more household decisions. They're increasingly a large and important consumer base for companies. And so we've seen banks, for example, think about loan products that target women. We've seen mobile phone providers think about apps for women. Again, very, very early days with this space, but I think, again, some more and more interest on the part of private sector companies. And lastly, and I think this is an area where it'll be interesting to see how the next 3 or 4 years play out, is the role of the private sector through its corporate social responsibility and foundation arms, as well as the role of the private sector in advocacy. And here we've seen some interesting energy, particularly out of some of the private sector companies we interact with in Europe. So our McKinsey office in Germany is involved in a coalition of private sector companies, as well as some media organizations and universities that has set up this initiative under Chancellor Merkel that is looking at how you can increase the presence of women in leadership, and specifically what are best practices that different companies can share with each other, what are toolkits that companies can create, what does unconscious bias training look like, all of these kinds of topics that everybody talks about but now is actually talking to each other about. And I think more importantly, sharing not just what works but what doesn't work, right? So being really transparent with each other in this coalition form. So I think that's an exciting development, and we like to see more and more of this space where private sector companies can interact and speak with each other and learn from what each of their organizations are doing. So I think the most exciting piece that we're involved with along this dimension is actually in India, where we are in the process of setting up a coalition across private sector companies that are local companies in India, as well as our McKinsey office. And the goal of this coalition is to think about how to increase women's economic empowerment, but not so much from a corporate perspective, but how, again, these companies can employ women in their supply chains as well as in their distribution channels. So we have a few interesting pilots that we are in the process of launching with a set of companies. And I think this space is one that we're quite excited to explore, and I think we're seeing a lot of energy from a few of our offices around the world with local organizations interested in playing this role. Because I think they recognize the need to partner with government, and they recognize how it can impact their bottom line. And so, again, an area I'm excited to see develop in the next few years.
I think, I mean, from my point of view, having now gone almost all the way around the table, from multinationals to bilaterals to now NGO, I do believe NGOs can put, a few 100,000 more kids in school, but if you want to really move the needle, you have to get the governments involved. And then the role of government policy, both at home, but also in terms of that international development piece, is key. So I think we will, in terms of what you can do, it's that boring stuff. Call your congressman, make a noise about it, show that you care about this stuff, you understand the links. I'm from the UK, and the UK's foreign policy has 3 key legs as set out by Boris Johnson: security, prosperity, and development. And they're seen as part and parcel of promoting the UK's national interests abroad, particularly in this moment in the context of Brexit. So I think this business about understanding what the international dimension is hugely important. So get on the blower and talk to people. The second thing, though, I think is there are places and there are sort of moments in the specific policy issues where the international solidarity has got to be rock solid, and where the, if you like, the domestic steps firmly into the international and actually undermines the rights of people that you will never see, you will never know. And in this instance, issues and regulations around what USAID money can or cannot be used for in the sexual reproductive health moment. These are hugely important for a whole lot of not American women around the world, and that is something that we should all think about. But from my point of view too, see something, say something, or each one reach one. I think really important that we think about young women and the next generation. We had a workshop just last Thursday in our building in NDI, thinking about, okay, we've traditionally focused on women of voting age and above, but all the studies tell us that for politics, that's too late. You've already lost them. And as one of our colleagues told us on Thursday, the maximum moment of female leadership and impact is an 8-year-old girl. 8. And, trying to really, we're not going to start programs, don't worry, with 8-year-olds, but trying to reach back as far as we can to really help and guide them through puberty, make sure that leadership goes, hand in hand. The wonderful man from the Pop Council told us that, the key dynamic at puberty is that girls' world horizons shrink dramatically. And boys' world horizons expand dramatically at puberty. So how do we actually get young women through that most dangerous period of life in ways that allow them to take advantage, from my point of view, of leadership and political empowerment opportunities that may come along, in order that they can then hardwire some of this other stuff into place for their own lives. I mean, the single biggest change that you could make to any Indian woman is to get rid of dowry. You know, that is at the root of her undervaluation, is the fact that she has a monetary figure attached to her, basically her reproductive and her mid-adult life. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? As I said, from my point of view, integrating women into the economy is great, just doesn't go far enough, because that's not going to topple over the dowry issue.
So
And you get the final word.
Well, I deeply worry about what you're raising here, because at World Learning, for example, we are committed to public-private partnerships. We deal with a whole variety of foundations. We deal with non-U.S. government supporters. But the truth is, the vast majority of the resources that we have are implementing USAID projects. So right now, we are training 90,000 teachers in Pakistan to build a literacy system that's open to girls, that's liberal, that can compete with the madrasas, and frankly, that provides a quality education. By the way, my board was very reluctant to get involved in girls' education in Pakistan. I went out and bought 25 copies of I Am Malala, sent each and every one a copy, and said, if you don't think it's in our mission to be involved in girls' education, and after reading this book, let me know. No one did. I'm not sure anybody read the book, so we're doing that. We are working on STEM education for high school girls in Egypt. And we have schools that have been set up where girls at the age of 14 and 15, you know, girls who are sitting there snapping selfies with you when you visit them, are winning Google international prizes because they're coming up with global solutions to technology challenges using digital fabrication laboratories and 3D printers and the capacity to do data paloozas and hackathons and crowdsourcing. We're in Lebanon, where we're providing a pathway for 320 communities to integrate adolescent girls from Syria into the education system, because there's a real challenge. As you know, about a quarter of the people in Lebanon now are Syrian refugees, and the system is just clogged, and so they need the capacity to do this. We are in Kosovo right now, helping reform the entire higher education system and genderizing it so that there's a gender studies department, but also every other part of their institutions are gendered. I just don't see the private sector coming in and supporting those kinds of programs. There's always going to be that opportunity cost and that social value that can't be captured by an individual company to doing this. And so I would simply finish by saying I agree with Sandra, write your congressman, and more appropriately, your congresswoman.
Yeah. It's funny, a reporter told me once that the question that he always asks people he's interviewing is, what keeps you up at night? He thinks that's a really good way to kind of get at kind of the crux of what the person's interested in. And for me, what keeps me up at night is that the United States has gone very far down the road with a lot of people around the world saying, if you support women and girls, we will be with you. And I worry a lot about what happens if we're not there. Obviously, it will have a huge impact on those girls, on those women, but it's going to have a huge impact on their communities and their countries as well, and that's going to make all of us less safe and less prosperous, and that would be a huge tragedy. So, in any case, thank you all. I really appreciated you coming. It was an incredibly interesting conversation. Thank you for my wonderful panel.